Hey everyone, Ben Yunson here, and yes, today we're going to talk about that list. Rolling Stone's 250 greatest guitarists of all time, a list boldly asserting that it has found and subsequently ranked the 250 best guitarists ever from 250th place to first place. I think it's fair to say that this list warrants a bit of discussion and analysis. I think the list includes some of the greatest guitarists of all time, but it also happens to omit many of the greatest guitarists of all time. So in fairness, let's take a look at what it got right, and let's also take a look at what it got very wrong. Before we have some fun talking about this, it would be great if you could like this video, and if you enjoy the video, consider subscribing to my channel and click the bell down below so you don't miss any of my playing videos, lesson videos, or discussions much like this one. The current decade we're living in is of course the 2020s, and I'm not sure that I can think of one person in this time, whether they're a musician or otherwise, who gets terribly excited when Rolling Stone releases one of its new lists. Since 2020, there's been a revised list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, a revised list of the 500 greatest songs of all time, the 200 greatest singers of all time, and you begin to get the idea. At this point, I'm not entirely sure what purpose is being served by creating these lists, other than perhaps to generate outrage amongst people so that the publication stays alive. Just speculation, of course. Let me know in the comments what you think. In a 1982 interview on The Today Show, Bryant Gumbel famously asked Miles Davis if it was important to him how he was ranked, as in whether or not he was seen as being the best. Miles Davis famously responded by saying you can't say best in any form of the arts. I'd have to agree with Miles Davis on that, and as a result I have to voice my objection to ranking artists in the form of these lists. Now let's talk about where I think Rolling Stone gets it right. There are many guitar luminaries who are on the list, and I think that we can probably agree that most of them absolutely should be on the list, and there's a good chance that you already know who they are. There are also some younger additions to this list who I think are brilliant guitarists, and I am personally really glad to see Rolling Stone covering a broad span of eras all the way up to now, including brilliant guitarists like Tosin Abasi, Yvette Young, and Christone Kingfish Ingram. I think this is great because rather than just focusing on one classic era, I think it really acknowledges that the guitar is still being developed into the 21st century, and particularly by some really original guitarists who have their own approaches. There are also a number of classic guitarists who've often been overlooked in the past in these types of discussions. For example, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Charlie Christian, and even Hugh McCracken, all of whom are very different guitarists, but I was very glad to see them included. But sadly, the fundamental flaws of this type of list begin to emerge when you observe, firstly, where certain people are being ranked. For example, coming in last place at 250th is Andy Summers. That one was very strange to me. And secondly, you begin to notice the glaring omissions. Legendary guitarists who've contributed so much who were not included in this list. The more I thought about it, the more names I began to think of that weren't present, and quite honestly I found it pretty shocking. I certainly don't think that anyone should be replaced on this list, but rather I would propose that the list should be expanded to acknowledge the massive contributions by a wide array of guitarists who have essentially been ignored by this list. So, in no particular order, here are 10 of the greatest guitarists of all time who were not included in the initial list of 250. I certainly could have added more, and if you're not familiar with any of these names, I really urge you to look them up. And if there are any guitarists that weren't included that you feel particularly strongly about, make sure you jump in the comments and let me know. Let's start off with George Benson. Now, George Benson isn't exactly an obscure jazz guitarist who released one album in 1964 and then called it a day. George Benson is currently 80 years old and he's still playing and sounding great. He also happens to be a 10-time Grammy Award winner. His album Breezin' from 1976 hit #1 on the Billboard Top 200. Yes, that's the pop chart. On Breezin', 5 out of the 6 tracks are purely instrumental, and I believe these 5 tracks contain some of the greatest improvised guitar solos that you are ever going to hear. Additionally, his album Give Me the Night hit #3 on the Billboard Top 200. I think George Benson is a pretty well-established guitarist at this point, and that is certainly an understatement. He's one of the greatest to ever do it. It's frankly bizarre that he is not on this list. Next up we have Robben Ford. Robben Ford has covered more ground stylistically than most people could ever imagine, starting from his early days playing with Jimmy Witherspoon, playing with George Harrison, Tom Scott and the LA Express, Joni Mitchell, played with Michael McDonald, and of course playing with Miles Davis. His 1979 solo album The Inside Story was basically the foundation of the band The Yellow Jackets. He's also had an incredible solo career for decades, all the way up to some of his more recent albums like Pure and Purple House, which showed just how fresh he is still sounding to this day. How is he not on this list? Next up we have Stanley Jordan. In 1985, Stanley released Magic Touch, which was a massive hit internationally and influenced guitarists the world over, myself included. When someone comes up with their own unique improvisational style that's immediately recognizable and also includes a completely new two-handed technique used for improvisation, I think that might qualify Stanley as being one of the greatest of all time. Now let's talk about John Scofield. John Scofield has come up with one of the most original improvisational approaches to the guitar in the history of recorded music. There's just no question about it. He's so original that you can often hear people emulating him even to this day. He of course had a famous tenure in Miles Davis's band, but in addition to this has had a brilliant solo career spanning over 4 decades, all the way up to his most recent album Uncle John's Band, which is really fantastic. You should check it out. One of the most influential guitarists in history. Not quite sure why he's not on this list. Next up we have another stunning omission, Neil Schon. Neil Schon recorded on 2 Santana albums while he was still a teenager, and in 1973 he formed Journey, which is now in its 50th year. He's still going strong. I mean, come on, Neil Schon recorded literally some of the greatest and most famous guitar solos in the history of recorded music. I mean, you know there's someone, somewhere in the world right now, trying to play the solo from Don't Stop Believing. If that doesn't qualify you alone to be on this list, then I'm not really sure what does. Next I'd like to talk about Earl Klugh. In this case, Rolling Stone is most certainly clueless, literally, because they didn't include Earl Klugh. I mean, Earl Klugh's had a career spanning like 5 decades now. He's known for his very unique fingerstyle approach that blends classical guitar and improvised music, and it really is very much his own thing. If you haven't heard Earl Klugh, you need to check it out for yourself, and a great place to start is his album Late Night Guitar, or pretty much any Earl Klugh album really. Now let's talk about Emily Remler. Emily Remler was a brilliant guitarist who left us far too soon and contributed so much in a very short time span. Herb Allis believed she was the best person to continue the tradition of jazz guitar, and when you go back and check out albums of hers like East to West, you can hear exactly what he was talking about. Leonard Feather wrote for the LA Times in 1989, Remler at 31 has entered a plectrum pantheon that numbers only a few of her most talented elders, Joe Pass, Jim Hall, Kenny Burrell. Emily sadly left us in 1990, but she left behind a huge legacy which I think we should honor. Now let's talk about Allan Holdsworth. Yes, Allan Holdsworth was not on this list. Before we even get to his massive contribution in his own right, very few people played with Soft Machine to Tony Williams, shared the stage with Eddie Van Halen, pioneered usage of guitar synthesizers. He pretty much completely reinvented how to craft an improvised solo on the guitar neck. Many people, including Robben Ford, have referred to him as the John Coltrane of the guitar, but I suppose then again Robben isn't on the list either, so there you go. Now let's talk about Kevin Eubanks. Aside from being a really unique and incredibly creative guitarist, his album Opening Night is frequently cited by guitarists as being hugely influential. He also happened to be the band leader of The Tonight Show for 15 years, which was watched by millions, if not billions of people over the entire world over the course of 15 years. When they started airing The Tonight Show in Australia, I used to tune in just to watch Kevin Eubanks, even if it was only to hear him play into the commercial break and then back out of the commercial break. I just wanted to hear him play, and I would most certainly consider him to be one of my early guitar influences. Of course, outside of The Tonight Show, he continues to have a brilliant career, and I love his collaborations with artists like Dave Holland. He should most certainly be on this list. And finally, Hiram Bullock. If you haven't heard of Hiram Bullock, then you most certainly have heard him play. He's another great legend who's sadly no longer with us. As a session guitarist, you've certainly heard him on recordings by the Brecker Brothers, Shaka Khan, Spyro Gyra, Paul Simon, Sting, Steely Dan. He had a famous association with David Sanborn. You've certainly heard Hiram Bullock play somewhere. He also had a fantastic solo career. You've got to check out his solo on Window Shopping from his album From All Sides, his first record for Atlantic Records in 1986. He was also one of the original founding members of Paul Schaefer's band on David Letterman's show in 1982. So Hiram definitely needs to be talked about here. So there you go, 10 legendary guitarists who were not included, who most certainly should have been. Let me know your thoughts, let me know who wasn't included, who you love. I certainly could have gone on a lot longer, but maybe I'll save that for another video. Make sure to give this video a like so we can push it out to as many people as possible, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit subscribe down below and click the bell for notifications so you don't miss any of my future playing videos, lesson videos, or discussions much like this one. I'll see you next time. They also left out Jay Graydon, Lee Ritenour, Mike Landau, Michael Thompson, David T. Walker, Johnny Guitar Watson, Alan Murphy, Adam Rogers, Drew Zing, George Wardenius, Jeff Scott. He played on albums by Daryl Braithwaite and James Rain, which we loved in Australia. Tommy Emmanuel and Brett Garsett, and I'm leaving out Eric Gale and Cornell Dupree. I mean, they also didn't mention Howlin' Wolf and Dean Parks and Paul Jackson Jr., Ray Parker Jr., Brent Mason. They didn't mention Orianthi,